Hello, mentors. Welcome to our podcast series, Mentorships in Education, brought to you by Just Education at justeducationfirst.com. I am your host, Judith Epstein. I am very excited about the wide range of experts who have volunteered to give up their time and expertise. They will share their innovative ideas, their exciting perspectives, their rich resources, and their research with us. Please continue to delve into these topics on their websites and with your legal counsel, healthcare provider, and education professional. Our guests will have information that will be relevant to mentors supporting struggling students, parents, teachers, administrators, legal support, and health professionals. We will address all levels of education with issues that affect academic performance. Our goal is to open discussions and introduce a variety of approaches to those searching for information in a free venue. So mentors, let me introduce our guests for today. Welcome mentors to our podcast series, Mentorships in Education, sponsored by Just Education First. This is Judith Epstein, your host. We're going to start a new mini-series today on behavior and behavior remediation, where parents and teachers and other mentors that work with students gain an understanding of some of the foundation information that contributes to some of the behavior that we see. We have a very important guest today to begin this new series, Dr. Michael Hart, and is going to give us a perspective on the brain and some of the connected behavior and the traditional perceptions versus some of the research that we have now that contradicts some of those traditional thoughts. So, Dr. Hart, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Nice to see you and for all the time that you've given to this. Dr. Hart has more than 25 years experience as an international literacy expert, an entrepreneur, and a consultant. Dr. Hart's very unique background provides him with the authority as well as the expertise to challenge the status quo of global literacy initiatives and lead the charge in providing new solutions. And this is what caught my eye when I asked Dr. Hart to come on. It's such an important movement that he's involved in right now. After completing his PhD in psychology, Dr. Hart began his career as a child psychologist, practicing in diverse psychiatric treatment settings that included working with primary and secondary school students. As his career progressed, he developed an expertise in learning challenges and attention issues. He has a passion for understanding neurologically based processing problems, and this drove him further in his research under the mentorship of some top psychologists at renowned institutions, including Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital and the Kennedy Krieger, if I'm saying that right, Institute at Johns Hopkins Medical Center. Dr. Hart went on to receive a Master's of Business Administration, and at first I wondered why you did that, and then I read a little bit more about it because it seems so counterintuitive in your field. But you got it from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, and I think I understand a little bit more now why you did that, but I will certainly be asking you about that. Dr. Hart's work is used by some of the leading international organizations focused on moving the needle in society's understanding of learning differences. Some of his most notable achievements include recent co-chair of the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, literacy expert for Understood.org, one of the largest global repositories of information on learning and attention issues. I've never heard that before, so that's interesting. Founding board member of TED Nashville, chair speaker selection committee for over 4 years. Is that got anything to do with TED Talks?
They are TED Talks on a local basis.
Oh, okay. All right. I was just wondering because it was written the same way. So I am so pleased to have you here. We had a wonderful conversation earlier, and you shared so much information, and I was so busy taking notes profusely that I had to look up some of the things that you said. But let's start with your interest in dyslexia and ADHD. Maybe you can talk about a personal connection you may have had to these, or what started this whole direction that you found yourself going into?
So, my interest in dyslexia and ADHD really evolved out of my ongoing professional development and practice. You know, I've been a psychologist working with children and families my entire career. And so part of that will clearly be working with kids in schools. And so, you know, early on you find out that dyslexia and ADHD are two of the most frequently seen issues in school. And for my entire career, I've been very concerned because, quite frankly, we're not providing the teachers with the right training and education in order for them to be able to identify these kids more effectively and then therefore know what to do in the classroom. So one of my favorite statistics is from the National Center for Teacher Quality, or National Council for Teacher Quality, is that in the United States, in spite of all of our wealth and in spite of everything we do, by fourth grade, 2/3 of our kids are below proficiency in reading.
Wow.
So it's this massive conundrum, and it just became my passion because it's like, it doesn't have to be that way. And so I've been trying to do what I can to do my part in trying to educate teachers and parents about how we should properly take care of these kids in the schools. And then when I started working in India for UNESCO, it was fascinating because they are so wide open over there in terms of wanting to learn the best way to teach their kids, because, you know, they haven't even had laws on the books for more than 6-7 years with regard to take care of kids. If kids had real significant disabilities, they just weren't allowed to go to school. So now they're been very, very good in terms of the percentage of kids that are going to schools. They still need a great deal of help in terms of training the teachers properly. So that's a super exciting opportunity for me that I'm pursuing.
India must be a new frontier for education, because so many of the people I've spoken to are getting involved in what's happening in India. It seems like they are the new space program for education.
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons for it. One, there's 350 million kids in K-12. And by second-ish grade, the vast majority of those kids are being taught in English. Oh. So you have this huge group of people over there. And like I said, they're hungry for knowledge. And they have this ability to leapfrog in terms of technology, so that, you know, rather than, you know, say, so the biggest example is when they were blowing out phone usage in India, they went straight to cellular. They didn't bother doing landlines because the technology was available and it could scale much, much more quickly. And the same thing is happening in education now. They all have phones. They all download information that they want to use, and it's ubiquitous now. Even in the rural areas, they have the ability to get phones that are affordable. And I think they're the second or maybe the first largest population for Facebook, and another app called App. And so they're much more sophisticated than people realize. And
yeah, we don't think of it that way. You mentioned that like 2/3 of the students in this country, by the time they're in middle school, are reading below grade level. And I was looking up actually the United States position in the world. You know, academically, we used to be like number one. And it depends what report you look at, but in some of them we're way down, like 9, 10, 11, 12. We've really fallen. And would you attribute that to this issue of reading? And I realize it's not that simple, but that certainly reading is a contributing factor to us not performing as well, being able to compete.
I think it's one of the major factors. Like you said, it's very complex.
Right.
But, the old adage is from first grade to third grade, you learn how to read. And from fourth grade on, you read to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And
right, I forgot about that.
Yeah. So if you're behind by fourth grade, and the environmental expectations are that you're going to be increasingly more independent, you're going to have bigger workloads, you're going to be expected to kind of organize around what they want you to do. And so the kids just keep falling further and further back. And I think some other cultures just are doing a better job, frankly.
I know we're spending a little bit of time on your background, but I want our listeners to understand some of the areas where you're considered an expert. And you mentioned to me that you work as an expert witness sometimes for kids who are struggling, who need to have some support. Can you explain a little bit about why you are brought in as an expert witness? What is your function?
Well, I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later. But
yes.
When I left Johns Hopkins, I went to, I was a chief clinician in a school in Annapolis, Maryland, called the
Mm-hmm.
Summit School.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a school that was both public and private in the sense that parents could take the school district to an administrative hearing or administrative law hearing. And if the school could not prove, or the school district could not prove, that they were able to provide an appropriate educational placement for their child, then they were able to go to Summit School, which was then paid for by the state.
Wow.
Yeah. And so my role was to go in and serve as the expert for the families. And I don't do this anymore. I just want to make that clear. But
that's fine.
I used to be the person that went in and testified for the family and the
Mm-hmm.
child in order to help the administrative law hearing judge make a determination about whether the school was doing their proper job or not. And
okay, so, I've spoken with some advocates, and they tell me that they'll be on down the road, but they tell me that you're often the person, globally, that they will bring in. If they don't have the knowledge themselves, they will often turn to someone like you to come in to support the child.
And the other thing about it is it can be quite adversarial. And so, when you're in the education world or the psychology world, you don't really, lots of people don't want to be in that situation where you have to do battle and, you've got lawyers trying to trip you. I mean, it's the whole legal thing. So I just felt it was really, really hard, but I just felt like somebody's got to do it. You got to do it. The reason I talk about myself as a rare hybrid is because 15 years into my career, I got the entrepreneurial bug, and I was seeing that there was this burgeoning, the internet was starting, and I could see where educational software was going. And so I wanted to get involved in trying to bring educational software to schools. And I had zero business experience. So I went back and I got into the business school, and I got my MBA, which is very rare for people in my world.
Yes.
Because they're built to be caretakers and, healthcare professionals and things like that. And I kind of like balanced between two worlds where I learned a heck of a lot about business, and I had a really solid foundation for my psychology practice as well. So that's when we get into that a little bit later on, that's what gives me the kind of skill set and experience to be able to try to do some entrepreneurial ventures in the ed tech.
I can see now where there might be some link to the two, and that's rather interesting. I know you're launching a new website, and perhaps this is a good time for you to talk a little bit about the true literacy that you're working on?
Sure. So in addition to whatever I do here or elsewhere in the world, I was part of this group with UNESCO in India where I was co-chair of a committee that was building out and designing literacy projects in India. And so over the last few years, I got to know who's who in the dyslexia world in India. And in fact, my co-chair is one of the top neuroscientists in India, and she does a lot of research with kids that have dyslexia and autism and other things. So we have kind of decided that there's such a huge need over there that I'm starting a website in just a couple of weeks. It's called trueliteracy.in, which is the .com of India, basically.
Oh, okay. I wondered where that came from.
Yeah. And my goal is a couple of things. I want to be able to provide a digital platform in order to support teachers in their efforts to learn about how to take care of our kids that we're starting to identify over there, and provide a lot of support to the parents and the kids. And I'm also serving as a platform for others who have educational technology applications for their own platform that wants to launch into the Indian market. So I'll provide all the marketing and the exposure, and people will be able to come to my website, see what kind of products I have from other colleagues of mine who have something that may very well be very useful.
Is this only going to be available in India, or will anyone be able to? Everyone?
Anybody. Yeah. I mean, it has the .in, but it's just like any other domain. It's going to be available.
Okay. All right. I just kind of wanted to clarify that because I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I'm going to focus on India at first, but really it's, I can go anywhere in the world with it. But.
So if I was looking to get some information on ADHD or dyslexia, and what kind of questions might True Literacy help me with, with finding some answers?
We're going to primarily focus on dyslexia. Mm-hmm. And so I have an increasingly more robust resources page that has books, webinars, papers, all kinds of in-depth websites, all kinds of in-depth information that would allow somebody to dive as deeply as they want to go.
Wow, it's like a library then. It's like a library.
It's like resources that are all in the same place.
And will people have to pay to access any of these? No, it's all be free.
That will be me supporting places like Understood and places like Yale Dyslexia and Creativity, and places like in the books that other people have written, like my friend Kelly Sandman Hurley. So those are going to be just me making it available to them in one place. And then with the products, then we'll be pricing those at a level that is going to be really, really affordable for a big group of people.
All right. I want to get into some of the nitty-gritty of why you were invited here today.
Okay.
Because you have such a great approach, and I love some of the terminology you use. And I want to start with your quote. I love to quote people when they come up with catchy phrases, and you say teachers are brain changers. And give me a little idea about what you mean by that and how that translates into teachers. And that doesn't just mean, I would assume, teachers in a classroom. That's teachers who could be advocates working with kids. These are teachers who are administrators who are working with kids. These are anyone who is working with a child, and tell me if I'm wrong, in a symbiotic way where they're trying to develop a relationship with a child. Am I right?
I think the real brain changers are the people who are directly impacting a child's education. So the teacher in the classroom, I want teachers to know that the neuroscience is very clear now that they are changing these kids' brains. especially in the earlier years, because they're learning all this stuff that is actually changing the way their brain is wired. And so it's a very, very helpful thing for teachers to know how they're doing that and what the neuroscience is saying, because that can drive how they think about their kids, what they choose to teach in the classroom, particularly with all the digital technology. What's the impact of that on the kids in terms of how the brain gets wired? And I just think that, so one big example I use is that reading. That's, my area. It wasn't really clear until recently that, and by that I mean about 20 or 30 years, that reading is not something that comes naturally to the brain. Now, language, the brain is wired for language. So in any culture, at a certain point, like, say, for instance, 16 to 18 months, they start using language. But the brain is not actually wired to learn how to read because it's only about 10,000 years old. So we have to be aware that this is something where we're basically repurposing different parts of the brain in order to help the children become automatic and proficient in their reading. And so we're kind of hijacking certain neural pathways and certain neural structures in order to kind of combine with language and help them become effective readers. And so, I find that teachers are really fascinated to be able to see, look, this is how the brain is wired, and when you do this, this is what happens. So, for instance, there's classic studies where you have a group of kids who are exhibiting struggling reading, and you can do a test called a functional MRI. We all know what an MRI is.
Yeah.
And so before there's treatment, we take pictures of their brain while they're doing something that's related to reading, and we look at what structures and what pathways seem to be involved in that process. Then we intervene in the classroom for several weeks, and then we redo the neurological testing, and you can clearly see very, very significant changes in the areas of the brain that the child is using to learn how to read. In fact, I know you put it up on your site. There's one of my slides shows the difference pre and post for a young child who struggled with reading, got intervention, and then was retested afterwards with the fMRI. And you can see very, very clearly the dramatic differences.
All right, let me just interject here. You have provided very nicely several slides that you're going to be referring to, and I do want our listeners to know that those slides will have a link on this recording so that they can go and check on the website and see the pictures of the diagrams that you're referring to and be able to follow along with what you're going to be saying. I think that's very important because that's so amazing. Traditional education has gone in a different direction for so long, where we think kids are being stubborn and they're being contrary and they just want attention. And here we're beginning to develop visual confirmation that there is a difference between these different brains.
Correct.
Is the difference between the brains have anything to do with intelligence?
Not really. When you talk about dyslexia, it's very, very, well, it's not very, well, it is very, very specific, but it's a process that the information goes through certain parts of the brain. With ADHD, it's more diffuse and more global, but the concept of intelligence and the way the brain is wired is so much more complex than that it can certainly impact your performance, but it doesn't actually impact your raw intelligence. Those are very separate things. So you could have, like the absent-minded professor, right? They're incredibly brilliant, but they can't find their keys half the time when they go to leave the house. So it's that kind of, it's the complexity of how the brain is wired, but it could impact your ability to test for intelligence, but it does not impact intelligence. People just need to know how to test for it.
So when you say it impacts your ability to test for intelligence, according to some experts, we have a very narrow approach to defining what intelligence is. And, some believe there are many forms of intelligence. Howard Gardner, for example. And is that part of the approach that, or the belief that you have when you say it doesn't really affect the intelligence, it may affect the outcome of a test? We're not testing the right thing, in other words?
Well, we have to be skilled enough to understand that, say for a good example is attention and concentration. Mm-hmm. The traditional test that's used for intelligence in 98% of the world is the Wechsler scale, right?
Right.
And far too many people are trained to believe that the overall score is really reflective of what's going on. But quite frankly, when you see a child who has some different wiring in their brain, you're going to see more of a sawtooth profile where there's going to be strengths and there's going to be weaknesses. And so you have to get away from saying, oh, this kid has a 100 IQ or 120 IQ or 30 IQ, 130. You just want to say, okay, this is what we understand, how the child's brain is processing based on the substrate scores that are being used to create that overall score. Because if you have a great deal of variability, then that overall score really doesn't mean anything, because you're not looking at what specifically is going on for a child when a certain type of cognitive test, or maybe they were just really, really struggling with concentration that day. Maybe they hadn't eaten, maybe they just came from a home where mom and dad were fighting. You don't know. You have to get that information and be super careful about how you interpret those numbers of intelligence. And that's why a lot of the scientists like Gardner are coming up with different models, because, some of these models are outdated.
That's a very I haven't heard anyone ever mention that specifically before. That's a very interesting way to evaluate a test. And it's true that we usually get a score, and, that's kind of what we put into their file. And no one really takes a look at the individual components. I won't say no one does, but I haven't seen anyone who does that. And it would help us, I would imagine, in teaching this child, if we could see that their visual scores were very high, or their auditory learning, or their reasoning, their processing, analysis skills were low. It would help us, I would imagine, to decide on a way to teach them things, rather than having everyone in the class do it the same way. I mean, we talk about differentiated learning, and I would imagine that would lend itself, kind of give us fodder for a good reason to introduce some other ways in the classroom. So this visual that you're talking about is on slide 2, the visual differences between ADHD and dyslexia. Is that correct?
Slide 2 shows the results of the study for dyslexia, and slide 3 is more of a general slide that shows you the areas of the brain that are oftentimes impacted with attention deficit disorders.
So when I'm asking you about does it affect intelligence, I guess I'm asking you our traditional sense of intelligence. And I always, my students will often say to me, I'm stupid, I can't do this. Their sense of self, their self-efficacy, if you will, their self-concept has been totally destroyed, because they've been told for so long that, you need to be in a special class, you need to be in a special group, you need to have, remedial help to do things, and they don't think they're smart. And I tell my students all the time that they're not the ones with the disability. The person who can't do it the way they do it is the one with the disability. They have very specific abilities, and that's what I mean by intelligence. Those very specific abilities may be drawing, for example. Some of these kids are so artistic and have such a visual brain. And I know I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. So, how do we interpret that? Is that intelligence?
I wouldn't frame it as intelligence. I would say I'd frame it as a strength.
A strength. Okay.
Yeah. And, that's the thing, is that it's so easy to fall into this trap where we are thinking about children in terms of what their deficits are. And we haven't really gotten the support and the training to figure out, well, we really need to get to know who this child is in terms of their strengths. What do they love to do? What are they really good at?
Uh-huh.
What could they share with their classmates? Who's important to them at home? So that you're thinking about ways in which you're protecting the kids from just getting ground down by deficit. One of my favorite other sayings is that 6 or 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months out of the year, our kids are being pummeled with messages that something is wrong with them. They're broken, they're a failure, they're stupid. And so that, you can imagine even as an adult being in that situation,
right.
You don't have the social and emotional wherewithal to deal with that as a little kid. So we have to kind of turn that on its head and start helping teachers figure out how to be positive focused versus negative focused.
Okay, you say it's very important that we need to turn it on its head. Do you have some ideas about how to do that?
Yeah, we got to start
doing what you're doing.
We got to start with leadership. Teachers have one of the most difficult jobs in the world. They have all of this pressure on them to do this, do that, do something the state wants them to do. And oftentimes they got way too much to do, and they don't get enough resources to do it properly. So what they need is a leadership structure in place who understand how to take care of the teachers so they have the emotional wherewithal and the skill set to be able to take care of the kids. And so step number 1 is leadership. Step number 2 is helping the teachers understand the model, the difference between deficit-based and strength-based.
And that's what you were talking about before.
And then give them very specific strategies that they can use in the classroom they don't have to do different curriculum. They have to integrate what they know about seeking out the children's strengths, building curriculum or lessons plans in the classroom that bring those out, and establish a relationship with these kids so that they feel like they're valued and cared for. And that'll go a long way for kids who really struggle with certain academic tasks. And then there's another value to that, and that is that the research shows that when you do that, when you focus on strengths and not deficits completely, that there's a much greater likelihood you're going to get parental involvement, which is really key community issue, because parents, frankly, they don't want to, every single interaction with the school is telling them about what's wrong with their kid.
Yeah.
And so they're just like, I don't want to be involved with that. I don't want to deal with that. And so they find in the research that clearly you engage the parents in a way that's positive and you talk about all the great things your kid's doing, much more likely that they're going to want to participate somehow within the school community.
That's fascinating. And I can see where that's true. I mean, parents stop calling the school. They stop coming in for meetings. They don't do the teacher conferences. They don't answer their phone. They don't return calls because they've just had it. They don't want to hear it anymore. And that's a perfect explanation. I really hadn't thought about that too much. You've very generously offered a list of recommended readings or sites. I want everyone to know that I'm not going to go through them all now, but they will be posted on the cover page of the podcast, and you can certainly visit them and get some other information other than what we're discussing today, or continue your search for more information. Doctor, can you kind of talk a little bit about what you're doing with because what you just talked about, how teachers how we need as teachers to change our approach to working with some of these kids. And I know that you're involved in some of this mentoring of teachers, am I correct? Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in that regard?
Yeah, I'm very clear that traditionally our professional development has been what we call one and done. So overwhelmed teachers, they have to go to their training session. Somebody comes in for an 8-hour day and they just, massive dump of information, and then they go away. You never see them again. And so teachers are human, so they tend to get jaded and tired. And I remember the last time I did it, the looks I got from them was extraordinary. And so I did some research, and there's an area of expertise called implementation science. And they specifically talk about education. They talk about how if you really want to change the behavior of a teacher, they need at least 50 hours of training and then 20 chances to be able to actually practice in the classroom before they're actually going to change their behavior. And that, of course, leads to the kids being able to do better. So what that means is one and done, which has been done forever, is not effective. So the model for me, and I'm working with a few people on this, but one of my key partners is a woman named Margie Gillis, who is the founder and executive director of Literacy How, which is probably a website we should include in there. And she talks about how you go in, you do the intensive training, and then you set up mentorships and coaching long-term, a couple of years, so that teachers can try things. They can videotape themselves. They can run it by their mentor, and they got the bandwidth or the timeline for them, the time frame, to be able to actually change their behavior, which then allows them to be more successful, which then makes them feel better, which then means they're going to do a better job, rather than just being, oh my gosh, this year's flavor of the month is this.
Having been there, done that, I had gone through all these for my PDFs over the years. You kind of feel like a deer in the headlights. I mean, you kind of walk out of there dazed with all this information, and where do you even begin to implement it? And so the idea of a webinar where people can go back and reread and ask questions at their leisure and be mentored. I'll throw out there that I found one of the best ways that I learned to be a better teacher was to find a teacher that was doing it right and to ask if I could go in and sit in on her class. And I don't think that we as teachers do that enough. We seem to be uncomfortable, maybe embarrassed, I'm not sure, but it was suggested to me, and I took someone up on it, and she invited me in her classroom, and I was so grateful that I did. And I went in several times and learned a lot from just sitting in there and watching her interaction with her students. So peer mentoring as peers, I think, is a very good way to help support what you're talking about. I also want to emphasize that one of the main points here is that students who are having difficulty, and please correct me if I'm not saying this right, but one of the main points is that students who are having difficulty in school who have been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD or dyslexia are not being stubborn, or they're not refusing to cooperate because they want attention. There is a physical difference in the brain between their brain and a typical brain. And the more we learn about how to develop those neural connections a little differently, the more successful these students will be. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, that's very accurate. It's really it's up to us, right, as the adults, to understand how their brains are wired. And you can imagine, like I was saying, day in and day out, if you're getting pummeled with all these expectations, and as adults, we're not doing our job to help them understand why they're struggling so much, how else would you expect them to act? So in one extreme, you have the kids who choose to act out, and on the other extreme, you have the kids who choose to withdraw. And that's just, they're doing their best to cope. And so once you see that, you got to understand that they're not just being oppositional. They're saying, hey, I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble. I need your help.
Right.
And
I've done a little studying with Ross Greene and read quite a few of his books. And one of the quotes that I like that he has, which is what you're saying, is that he never knew a child that, I'm not quoting him exactly, but woke up in the morning and said, I'm going to fail today. I'm going to do everything I can to fail. I don't want to fail. I don't want to be successful. I want to fail. And the kids aren't doing that. They go in gung-ho. They want to, and they've been beaten down so much that many of them have just given up. They're confused. They don't understand why they can't do what they're being asked to do. And in some cases, it's heart-wrenching. I do have a couple of quotes here that you've mentioned that I wanted to get to, one which we did, and I have another one that I want to get to. I wanted to have a discussion with you about the legal issue, and I know that you said that was so convoluted and it's so packed with information that you really can't go into that now. Maybe that's something we can go into another time. But you had some points that you thought might be helpful to our listeners. Perhaps if you could share those.
Well, just on a very global level, it's really important for parents to understand that they have legal rights. And oftentimes they get intimidated by the school districts or the school teams because they don't have a clear understanding of what their rights are. So it's super important that they arm themselves so that they can effectively advocate for their kids. And there's lots of different places where they can get that information. One we spoke about before we started today, which is it's a website called Rights Law, WRIGHTS Law. And I'm pretty sure that they were attorneys initially, but they have put together an extraordinary site for really doing deep dives into what your children's rights are and how to negotiate with the school system. So that's kind of the baseline. And it's a huge, huge issue. It's a huge topic. So I can't do much with it today with the amount I have, but it's super, super important for the parents to understand that a key piece of their ability to become the most effective advocates for their kids is to understand what their legal rights are. Because a lot of times, they don't get accurate information. So they feel stymied, they feel frustrated, they're scared, they're angry. And so that's part of the puzzle that they really need.
And rights law is not, I was a little confused when you mentioned to me, it's not a law like a law on the books. It's a website by someone named Wright who has started this website to make information available to people who are looking. Is it all forms of diagnoses? I call it the alphabet soup of diagnoses. So it covers all the different areas. It's just not on dyslexia, for example.
Correct.
You have a great quote here, Dr. Hart, that I would like you to elaborate on a little bit. You have alluded to it, but I want you to be more specific with some of the terminology here and explain what you mean. The quote is, "There needs to be a cross-pollination between clinical and educational experts who address the issue of difference in learning." Please.
Okay. So this is what I learned a long time ago, and this is what's kind of maddening in a lot of ways. We have literally a 50-year-old database about the science of reading, what works, what doesn't work, what we should be doing in the classroom. And that research has basically been done, and this is kind of general, pediatric neurology departments in the university and clinical psychology departments in the university. And then way across campus is the education building, the education department. And amazingly, there's very little cross-pollination. There's very little sharing of that information to people who are going through a university program to learn how to read. So that's where the core for me in my practice, really quite frankly, is figuring out how to cross that chasm and get that information to teachers. Because, by and large, you get some tired, kind of cranky, irritated teachers, but for the most part, they are really true heroes. And they want this information, they need this information, and they don't even know it exists. So it ends up, that's the key part about why 2/3 of our kids are not proficient in reading by 4th grade, because they're not getting access to the training and the ongoing support and the mentoring and the coaching with regard to what we've known for 50 years.
So the research isn't getting to the teachers, is that what you're saying? And
Right.
that goes back to the trainings that you're talking about in the webinar that you're developing to try and bring some continuity to these two areas in terms of integrating them. Is that?
I just want to integrate them. I just want to give the teachers the tools they need so that they can do a better job.
Okay.
And, I've had teachers that have been, I had a principal come up to me after a talk I gave, and she said, I've been a principal for 25 years, and I knew what we were doing. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I didn't know what was right.
Right. Boy, have I heard that before. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, I'm incredulous every time I hear that. So it's
Dr. Hart, you've illuminated me in so many areas, and I appreciate so much your time and patience in working with me to develop this podcast. I hope at some point we can get you to come back and go over some of these other areas that we haven't had an opportunity to delve into. You said that you might be able to talk a little bit more about executive function, some of the testing that's done with students and the different kinds and what they show, and certainly the legal issues are something that we could talk about. So we could probably keep you busy for a long time, but I hope that you'll at least be willing to come back once and draw a ticket on one of those issues and share with us some of the information. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, mentors, for joining us today. I hope you will go to justeducationfirst.com and learn more about what we do. Also, look over the other topics we have covered and some of the other guests we have who have been part of our podcast. In order to reach Dr. Hart, we will also have a link there for him so that you can contact him or ask him some questions if you would like to do that. You can also find him on LinkedIn if you would like to, Dr. Michael Hart. Our podcasts are also on YouTube and iTunes. We'd like to hear from you with some feedback or suggestions that you have. If there are some other guests that you would like to see. And most importantly, please subscribe so that you don't miss out on any of our future podcasts. This mini-series will continue for another 3 or 4 sessions. We have so many guests that have offered graciously and volunteering their time to share information with our mentors. You don't want to miss anything. You may be surprised at some of the guests that we have. They're coming from all over the world. Thank you so very much, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you, mentors, for being with us today. If you found this podcast of value, please visit justeducationfirst.com to subscribe to our blog and Mentorship and Education podcast, so that you may continue the exploration with us. Our goal is to provide a free treasury of information for our listeners, so they can become acquainted with the amazing resources that we have available to us. We want to thank all of our guests for giving their time and and sharing their wealth of information with us. Please also visit their websites and explore more of their resources to further your pursuit of the topic. Hope to hear from you at justeducationfirst.com. Have a good week, and thank you.